maybe you've never heard of, like a former slave named Hattie, some more famous people at the time who were probably not so famous now, like Dr. Rebecca Davis Lee Crumpler, who was actually the first female African-American doctor. Pat Tyson, who is over here, who I've known for many, many years, plays Hallie Quinn Brown, is a teacher, an author, a public speaker, and a community activist. And somebody you probably heard of is Elizabeth Keckley, who's another one of their members plays. In that free group is also somebody, a woman who's in the free group is named Marcia Cole. And Marcia Cole is our speaker tonight. Marcia Cole is an educator, a playwright, a poet, and a member of Free. She has many, many programs related around these positions, specifically focused on the contribution in history made by Charlotte Scott. You've probably heard of Charlotte Scott because Charlotte Scott was the formerly enslaved woman who started the whole process of raising money and the idea for having the Emancipation Memorial Monument that's in Lincoln Park. So she is here tonight. Marcia is here tonight as Charlotte Scott. So I want to welcome to the podium Charlotte Scott.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to come out and speak this evening. My name is Charlotte Scott. You may call me Miss Charlotte. I like the sound of that. I'm a free woman now, but it weren't always so. I was born in Virginia around 1803, 1805 on a plantation owned by Captain William Scott and his wife Anne. They owned over 1,000 acres of land along the James River, including Bedford and Campbell counties, that today you call Lynchburg. Back then, it was prime timberland before they cleared it to raise tobacco as a cash crop. They also owned a number of slaves, including my mother. You see, by law, if your mother was free, you were considered freeborn. But if your mother was a slave, well, you were a slave too. I was born into it. The Scots named me Charlotte. The naming of slave children was a privilege owners would take for themselves. But if a slave was sold, well, they might be given a different name by their new owner and would have to answer to that. I was never sold, and I kept the name Charlotte all of my life. There was a lot happening in the world around the time I was born, and what was important for me to underline was Ohio came into the Union as a free state. Captain and Miss Ann had 12 children, and I helped take care of many of them while they were growing up, and believe you me, there was always plenty to do. Early on, I wasn't much older than the one I was looking after. It was a common practice for owners to select a young slave to act as nurse for their children. Not because they had any medical knowledge, mind you, but really to keep an eye on them so they didn't hurt themselves and to be a companion. When Captain Scott died, he and Miss Ann had 9 surviving children. In his will, he left land, livestock, and personal property, which included slaves, to the 7 oldest children to divide up among themselves. The rest he left for Anne for her support. The 2 youngest boys, Hugh and Thomas, would get their portion when she died. But after a while, she took pity on them and said they could have their inheritance if they promised while she was still living, if they promised to take care of her until she passed on. And they did. By this time, I was married to my man Willis as much as slave marriages counted. Slave couples could be separated at any time for any reason. And we didn't have one of those abroad marriages where the husband lived on one plantation and the wife on the other, and he would have to get permission to come see her. We were lucky. We lived on the same plantation. And when those two brothers finished dividing things up, Willis went to Master Hugh, and I went to Master Thomas. And the good Lord saw to it that those two brothers had joining farms, so Willis and I got to see each other more often than most couples. Master Thomas married twice and had 5 children. I was about the same age as his first wife, Margaret. When Margaret died, their daughter, Margaret, was just 2 years old. I'd been taking care of that child from the time she was born and kept right on like I had been doing through the death of her stepmother and her grandmother. Little Margaret grew up and married Dr. Wood Rucker, her second cousin. You might say I was kind of her, when she got married, her father loaned me to her. And you might say I was kind of a wedding present. I helped her set household and do one thing or another. But when her father died, she inherited me outright, and his will had me down as worth $500. That was 1861. Time came, there was talk about going to war. North and South were at each other, brother against brother. I heard through the grapevine there was a big fuss about us colored folks being slaves. Some folks down south wanted to carry slavery out to the west, but there were other reasons too. Something they called states' rights, and they certainly couldn't agree on the election of Mr. Lincoln as president. Dr. Rucker came from a slaveholding family, but he was considered a Unionist. And this put him at odds with his family and Virginia neighbors. But after a while, his rash actions and loose talk landed him in jail. Yes, he landed in jail. He and Miss Margaret managed somehow to continue to get communications back and forth. And when the fighting got too close, they decided she should take their 4 children and household slaves to Marietta, Ohio. Remember, Ohio was a free state. But the Union soldiers wouldn't transport them unless she freed us first. That's how it came to be free in Ohio. That was 1862. Did you know slaves couldn't have last names? And nobody bothered about calling us Mr. or Miss. So I decided as a free woman, I should have a last name. That way I would have a full name, and I took the name Scott. I had the full name of Charlotte Scott. Now, being free, me and the others could have gone where we chose, but we all stayed in Marietta till after the war. I kept on as cook for the Ruckers and took in washing so I could earn some money and get to keep what I earned. The 1863 Emancipation Proclamation granted that colored people could earn money for their work, fair wages, and get to keep what they earned. So I pinched a little here, a little there, and set aside. So with the help of friends, Dr. Rucker got out of that jail. Well, and joined the family in Ohio. That war just kept on like it was never going to stop. But it did when General Lee surrendered April 9th, 1863. I was serving breakfast one morning to Dr. Rucker and Mrs. Rucker when there came a knock at the door. Really excited-like. It was a neighbor. He came in and he said, "Did you hear? Did you know? Have you heard?" Well, they hadn't heard. President Lincoln has been killed. Everyone just sat silent. They looked at one another. They didn't know what to say. So I spoke up first. I said, well, now the colored people have lost their best friend in life. They should raise a monument to his memory. Collect money and raise a monument. So I went to my room and where I've been saving the money that I have been setting aside. And I counted out and I had $5. I went back to where they were still sitting and said, "Dr. Rucker, help me get this money to someone honest who will help organize a fund drive from the colored people to raise a monument to that good man." Well, he thought it was a good idea, and he did. Now, $5 may not seem like a lot to you today, but back then, that was a lot of money. Others thought it was a good idea too, and eventually my idea got printed in the St. Louis newspaper. The Western Sanitary Commission was selected to collect the funds and make sure it got to the right place. Money started pouring in from people, colored people everywhere. The colored soldiers of Natchez, Mississippi alone donated $16,000 of soldiers' pay. And colored soldiers got paid less than the white soldiers, but they were glad to do it. All told, including interest on investments, colored people raised upwards of $21,000. I was proud of my people. The sculptor Thomas Ball was hired to come up with a design. A committee was formed to handle the details of the dedication ceremony. The date was chosen, April 14, 1876, the 11th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's death. You should have seen the crowd in Lincoln Park. They started arriving early. Colored people were everywhere. Stands were set up for the speakers. There was a parade. It started along K Street. It went up, along past the White House. Mounted police started it off, followed by colored troops, a marching band, people in carriages in their finery, followed by local people behind. Going past the White House, they met up with the crowd in Lincoln Park. When they announced I was there, you should have heard the cheers and whistles. Wow, I was really moved. There were a number of speakers to start things off. The highlight of that day for me was to see and hear Mr. Frederick Douglass. He was tall, handsome, educated sounding man. You could hardly believe he was ever a slave by the way he spoke. There was a hush over the crowd. His voice was deep and carried. There was fire in his eyes. He spoke for 30 minutes. President Grant was given the honor of pulling the cord to unveil the monument. Oh, the people really went wild when it came into view, with applause and cheers. There was Mr. Lincoln holding the proclamation in his right hand, and his left hand held over the colored man who was on one knee bent like he was rising. No need to scrape and bow. The man is looking up as he's getting up, looking forward to a life of freedom. Now some say Mr. Lincoln didn't care about freeing slaves. He just wanted to keep the Union together any way he could. Free the slaves or not free the slaves. Well, I say, no matter why he done it, and I'm glad he did. And he paid a price for it too. I hope every one of you will go over to Lincoln Park and take a look at that statue. It's right there on East Capitol Street Northeast between 11th and 13th Streets. And while you're there, look down below at the plaque. My name is right there with Mr. Lincoln's. That makes me feel proud. Let me read to you what it says, if you don't mind. Freedom's Memorial, in grateful memory of Abraham Lincoln. This monument was erected by the Western Sanitary Commission of St. Louis, Missouri, with funds contributed solely by emancipated citizens of the United States declared free by its proclamation January 1st, A.D. 1863. The first contribution of $5 was made by Charlotte Scott, a freed woman of Virginia, being her first earnings of freedom and consecrated by her suggestion and request on the day she heard of Lincoln's death to build a monument to his memory. Yes, he was a friend of the Negro, and history remembers me as a friend of Lincoln. They wrote about my passing in the Marietta, Ohio paper, but not the Lynchburg paper. I guess change comes hard for some people who want to stay in the past if it suits them. I'll leave you with this. If you have a friend, a true friend, who will stand by you and stand up for you, well, treat them right. Friendship is the real treasure in this world, then and now. In all my years of service, I walked the fine line between deference and dignity. I didn't know I was making history. I just did what I thought was right. If I may step out of character for a moment. I like to say that I was very privileged to participate in a ceremony to dedicate a marker to Miss Charlotte in Marietta, Ohio this past June. And I was able to present to Charlotte Scott. There was a Frederick Douglass reenactor, Michael Crutcher. Dr. Alistine Turley was there to speak. There was singing, and a proclamation was read, written by the mayor. If I may read that for you as well. The language of the proclamation. Just give me a moment. And Miss Charlotte has to put on her glasses. Charlotte Scott, a friend of Lincoln. Whereas Charlotte Scott was born enslaved by the on the Scott plantation near Lynchburg, Virginia, and became the property of William and Margaret Scott Rucker. And whereas at the start of the Civil War, Rucker is accused of burning a bridge, captured and imprisoned in 1862. Union authorities moved the Rucker family to Marietta for their safety, where Charlotte accompanied them as a domestic servant and was freed. And whereas upon learning of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, Charlotte was duly distressed and gave $5 of her first earnings to a local minister to build a monument to Lincoln's memory. Funds for the memorial were raised solely from former slaves or freedmen including former U.S. colored troops, and President Grant unveiled Emancipation Memorial in Washington's Lincoln Park on April 14, 1876, the 11th anniversary of the assassination, with Frederick Douglass as a keynote speaker. Charlotte attended the event. Abraham Lincoln and Charlotte Scott are the only names that appear on the memorial, and whereas after the war, Charlotte lived as a free woman on the Scott plantation until her death on January 24, 1891. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Lynchburg, Virginia. Now, therefore, I, Joshua D. Schlichter, Mayor of the City of Marietta, Ohio, do hereby proclaim June 19, 2023 as Charlotte Scott Day in the City of Marietta, and I urge all citizens to pay tribute to those that have overcome adversity and found freedom. And there's an official seal on there signed by the mayor. And I don't know if you can see it, but this is a picture of the marker, that the very handsome marker that the Mid-Ohio Valley Civil War Roundtable instigated this whole process of developing a marker. And this is a picture of me doing the marker. So I'm very thrilled that this took place because I think it would be very appropriate for a marker to be at the Emancipation Monument here in Lincoln Park to tell a fuller story than what is currently on the plaque. So people understand why that monument is there. It wasn't by happenstance. It signifies the importance of freedom by any means. And this man, the thing about the monument is, as someone has described, is a fixed artifact. So you can't see the full execution of the body mechanics of the figure. And it's been likened to a runner at the set position. And he's looking up, and if you know, originally the monument faced the Capitol Dome. And atop that dome is a statue to freedom. And what's key about that is that that figure of freedom was finished because an enslaved man who was working in the foundry where the statue was being developed, Philip Reed, he had observed all the processes of the foundry, and when the white designer would not complete the job unless he got paid more money, Philip was able to guide the workmen to finishing the job so it could be hoisted above the Capitol Dome. So originally that figure in the monument was indeed looking up to freedom. And that sort of, in my mind, secures it to that spot. And it would be out of context to put it anywhere else. And I hope that there are others who feel the same way so we can keep this history, because we can't sweep it under the carpet. Slavery was the bedrock of the foundation of the country, and so we need to acknowledge that. The word emancipation means something's taking place. Lincoln's holding an official document, and the man is exercising his own agency, his chains are broken, and he's standing up. And this figure is based upon an actual person. It's based upon Arthur Alexander, who made his own contributions to history. And it's also to be noted that Arthur Alexander was an ancestor for whom else but Muhammad Ali. And if you were to see the two pictures side by side, you would see the very strong resemblance. So people who support the idea came together with me to develop a website I hope that you will visit. It's a very easy one to remember, emancipationmonument.org. And there you will see different videos that flesh out the history of the telling of the monument. because there's elements on there that people don't look at, but give you more information. Now, one of the complaints about that statue is, people say, well, he looks like he's naked, he's shining Lincoln shoes. But no one has anything to say about the statue of David, who's fully naked. Or do they complain about a similar dress of Jesus on the cross? So it has nothing to do, you can't cherry pick what's acceptable and what's not. And in fact, some enslaved were in that state of undress. Certainly in the middle passage, no one came over in a three-piece suit. So I think we need to have a bigger picture and realize that this is a significant piece that deserves to stay there so it can provoke dialogue. Ask questions. How do we get where we are? All these things are worthy questions, and let us continue to ask them. Thank you. Any questions?
Well,
Yes.
question and comment. One is, I'm very well familiar, by the way, with Diane Rucker. There's a book about it, it's called Bridge Burner. The reason, I'm familiar with Dr. Rucker. There's a book actually about him called Bridge Burner. He was a slaveholder who was a doctor for the Union. And the reason after the Battle of Gettysburg, normally the surgeons would be released, but Rucker was captured, and they wouldn't let him go. So all the surgeons after the Battle of Gettysburg had to be imprisoned because of Rucker, who finally escaped in October, and then they let him go. But my question is, did he not assist you, Charlotte, with the statue also? With assist with the money raising and everything for the statue, Dr. Rucker.
Well, it certainly was instrumental, from my understanding, of assisting others to help in that regard.
Yeah, what was his role, is I guess the proper question.
I imagine something like a go-between between Charlotte and the people who he knew who could be helpful in raising the money. That's what I think.
The guy was apparently sort of a scoundrel, but he was a really interesting character.
He was an interesting character, yes. Yes.
Question for Miss Charlotte. Did you have any brothers and sisters, and what happened to them?
I don't know of her extended family, but I know she had 12 children.
She had 12 children.
That's what it's written.
And are they in the Washington, the descendants here? Are they scattered, or what?
Interesting you asked that, because I was at an event on Saturday at the monument, a lecture talk, talking about what was there and opinions. And it was well attended and varying opinions. And at the conclusion, someone approached me and said that their daughter was a descendant of Charlotte Scott. Now, this is all fresh, so I haven't talked with them, been able to talk, but I want to talk with them and see just where this will lead, because that will be very, very powerful in itself.
So it's 5-6 generations removed, probably. Great-great-great-grandchildren.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yes, I have not a question, but I'm just remembering things. Because we've been together on this for a while, working on saving the monument, the Emancipation statue. But I remembered some things just listening to you as you've told the story again. When I was learned to walk as a baby, it was important to my family to take me to your park. I'm thinking of you as Charlotte now. And to get a picture of my first baby steps walking in that park. And that was a tradition in my family that nobody actually took their first steps at the park. But once you learn to walk, 1-year-old, 9 months, 12 months, whatever, 14, we were taken to that park and to get the picture taken as walking, standing up. And I've thought of, that's an interesting kind of contrast with or affirmation, I should say, of the rising, and the sense that the young African American children walk near that statue. And this is something that's come to me just listening to you tonight. It's wonderful to see you on this ride. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Thank you very much. That was very useful. There's another Lincoln statue that's ready to be placed or unveiled, if you may, and that's at the African American Civil War Museum. And there's been some people have made some comments about it, saying that's unnecessary, that we have too many Lincoln statues in town. And I feel quite opposite of that because it's juxtaposition across from the Freedom Monument, to me makes great sense, because there it is, Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation, which enabled the 200,000 or so African Americans to join the US military. And they made a huge difference in Union victory. A surge of 200,000 men makes a big difference. And I think it was a very important element in the war and the Union victory. So I was wondering how you felt about that and how others feel about it.
Well, certainly the soldiers were an important part of the victory. And they were primed for it because they knew intimately what they were fighting for. So I think that is key and not to be forgotten, and certainly by the mention on the plaque of the contribution of the soldiers. That's something too. Because African American men have fought in every war in this country, fought for the country, and so it started in those early years, and not to be forgotten. But one thing I want to talk about is one of the comments people would say when they wanted to take it down was, well, he only freed the slaves because it was strategic. Well, then I asked myself, what previous president had freed a slave? Indeed, many of them were slave owners. So is Lincoln to be faulted for not freeing them all? Or would it have been better for him to free none? Would they have been happier with that? So I think the sensible answer is, he didn't free them all at one time, but he was poised to do so before he was assassinated. And many people don't know that. I didn't know that until fairly recently, that he was poised to do that in 1865, before he was 65, before he was assassinated.
Anybody else, questions, comments? Oh, Pat?
One thing that always amazes me is that a quote that President Lincoln made was that if it hadn't been for the U.S. colored troops, the Union would not have won the war. And so I use that often when I'm doing my presentation, because we're so glib to say so many things that we don't know about, you see. And that's the problem, is not knowing the facts, which is why we need to have some kind of history in school about American history. Now, I'm one who hated American history. I couldn't stand it. It was boring. It didn't have anything for me. But once I got in, and our teachers, I came from the military road school from Fort Stevens, where the teacher always took us up there and explained the battle and explained what went on up there. I liked the trip, but it didn't interest me. Wasn't until I was forced to do research to preserve our school that I found out about the history of DC and what went on here. And a lot of the records had been lost, but I found enough for what I needed. And I that's one reason why we like to go to schools, because the children need to know. If they don't know, the same thing is going to happen again. So I ask you all to pray that somehow we can turn this thing around, because most people are feeling like they're lost, and they don't have to pledge allegiance to the flag. They don't have to do anything if they don't want to. And we're growing up a generation of people who, once they're in control, we don't know what's going to happen to this country. It may be gone. So thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you.
Last call. Okay, so thank you both to Marcia Cole and to Charlotte Scott.
Hold it up, Marcia. Hold it. Get that man out of the way. Thank you.
And Marcia, we have a little gift for you, actually.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you very much for coming tonight and telling us about, or being, Charlotte Scott.
Thank you for inviting us.
So that wraps it up for tonight. Take a book on your way out. And thank you all for coming. The next event is October 17th, which is a Zoom-only event. But put on your calendar December 5th for luncheon here at Marciano's. And thank you all for being here.
Oh,